Yeah, let's get started. So maybe we'll start with quick introductions. First off, well, thank you for being here, and welcome to all those that are listening. And maybe we'll do a quick roundtable. PJ, start with you. Just a little background, what you're doing at Oxy, what's your role, and you kind of make the rounds.
Yeah, sure. Hey everyone, PJ LeBlanc. I work for Occidental Petroleum. I'm in the IT organization, but under the Industrial Control Systems group, and I am the manager of our newly formed in the last year an IoT platform and solutions group. And so my responsibility is shepherding pilots and ideas and proof of concepts that prove out to a productionized way of doing things.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I would say in that stage, it's the fuzz on the fuzzy front end.
Yeah. A lot of fuzz. Yeah.
A lot of fuzz. Cool. Philip?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Philip Griffiths. I look after global business development for NetFoundry. NetFoundry is a open core company where we have a SaaS version and an open source project where effectively we've built the ability to put private programmable connectivity inside anything, including apps or operating systems or the network, so we can make secure connectivity easy, simple, and free.
Cool. And Randy?
Hi, Rani Haibi. I'm the CTO of Networking, Edge, and Access in the Linux Foundation, where I help open source projects move forward with their innovation and also help them work better and closer together. I just joined the Linux Foundation recently, about a month ago, but I'm no stranger to open source. I've been working on open source project under the Linux Foundation and other organizations for several years now, so I'm quite accustomed to this culture of open source.
Very cool. Yeah. So the idea here was to bring together, obviously we're talking about the value of open source at the edge today. The idea was to bring together, Oxy, PJ, you kind of from an end user, what's been your journey? You're starting to explore as you guys build out your IoT solutions. Philip is similar to ZEDEDA, an open core model of taking open source and wrapping a kind of a business model around it. And then Randy, obviously very deep experience in the community, kind of on the front end, and how that works. And so we'll kind of, it's almost like the value chain of open source, or the life cycle, so to speak, was the thinking here. So we'll start with you, PJ. So like what kind of tell us about the history of IoT at Oxy, of how you guys kind of expanded, and of course edge computing is highly related. What's been the journey like? What's the journey been like, and how did you kind of come to the open source world along the way?
Yeah, sure. So it started, maybe 5 years ago with sort of technology investigation and evaluation. But what really kicked it off was a problem, right? A problem. And our problem was we had these old legacy controllers out in West Texas, right? And the company that made them sort of didn't make them anymore and didn't care to support them. And, we had thinking about replacing all these things. It was expensive, and it was just very frustrating, right, to not get the response and the support that we needed. So it was proposed, hey, could this be an IoT solution? And so we set out to do that, and using a lot of mostly open source components, we were able to basically replicate the functionality. It turned out to be not that complicated, and replicated the functionality of that controller, and then presented it as, hey, we can do this same thing, same basic functionality, basically for free, for using our own intellectual firepower. Oh, and by the way, if we do it, we can add on all this other stuff as well, right? And so we set out to do that, and that sort of proved, I think, really made people's eyes open about the value that IoT could bring for our organization. And so since then, it's been heating up, right? So there's use cases lined up, teams are being formed, like all that good stuff. And we consistently have turned to open source when we, frequently when we can't find the things that are available to buy, and they keep bringing value.
Yeah, it's surprising, the amount of stuff that's out there once you start kind of looking, and then of course you've got to kind of wrap and pull it all together. But it's the first step is taking a peek.
That's right.
Cool. We'll come back to some of the mechanics of it and all
Sure.
that. So Philip, so you guys, obviously have a commercial offer at NetFoundry, but I guess tell us a little bit about the decision to put a component into the open source world, and kind of how has that been? Because it definitely is. There's a whole different element to that part of it when you build a business model around it. So just give us a little background on that.
Yeah, there was a lot of considerations as to why we wanted to go the open core route. Most people, when they talk about networking security, aren't open source, so it actually gives you a major differentiation. But B, because we have this vision of, hey, if you can make private programmable connectivity really simple and easy, instead of saying, oh, developers can't do this, we need a separate network and security team, instead you can actually enable developers to do it. But developers, they love open source. They don't want to have to talk to a vendor. They don't want to have to go through a procurement cycle. They just want to go to GitHub, grab some code, throw it into what they're doing, and they're away. So the thought was always to go open source, because it enables you to really build a platform, a community. You're not just building a point product. You're building so much more than that. And then, kind of as PJ was saying, you're able to work with organizations that see the value in what you're doing and then start contributing code back to it. So you have the potential to build much more innovation, because people want to take what you're doing and tie it into what they're doing, and to build a feature over here that solves their thing but isn't necessarily on your core roadmap for that project. So from our perspective, it was the only way to go, because our vision is for everything just to be natively built with our open source project, in the same way that, if you're building an application nowadays, 99% of the time someone's going, we should build on Kubernetes, right? It should be on Linux, right? It becomes the standard. But we also know over the last 20 years that people don't want to host, or like the majority of people don't want to host their own infrastructure. That's why we have public cloud, because people are like, yeah, I could do this myself, but it's much easier just to buy it from Azure, AWS, whichever flavor you prefer. So that was really the thrust of, instead of giving just the option of open source, instead we would build the simple and easy version, which provides all the hosting and management. And really, I think one of the things we've seen recently in the open source community is people realizing how much it underpins modern life. And there's the joke that we've built these, this huge digital economy, and several layers to the bottom, there's this one little open source component that's managed by one person in their basement in Nebraska or something like that. And from our perspective, that's how we solve that conundrum. Open core gives you the ability to have all the best bits of open source, but then to have the entity that stands behind it, that maintains it, that makes sure that it doesn't go out of business, so that you're really able to build what, in our opinion, is the best commercial model for everyone.
Yeah, and that one person in Nebraska, it's like sponsored by Mountain Dew. It's just fueled by Mountain Dew. But no, I mean, that's a common misconception, is that you're at the whim of like one, kind of, or a very small pocket of developers, but that it really is a shared technology investment, which kind of leads me to Randy. So that was good. So Randy, like, for those that maybe don't understand how Linux Foundation works and how the communities work, a good starting point would be to maybe kind of give a quick overview. As EVOS that ZEDEDA leverages, open core model similar to NetFoundry. It's in LF Edge, and we put it in there for a reason. But kind of explaining how those communities work. Putting code on GitHub is not the same as putting it in the Linux Foundation. So what are some of the benefits, and how does it work from your standpoint?
Yeah, thanks. So indeed, the easiest part maybe is putting your code on GitHub and making the repo public, but that's not really it. It's really about, and I think Philip and PJ alluded to that, it's really about the community and the people, and bringing on board all the experts, making sure you have the best minds in the industry working on your project. So that's one of the main goals of the Linux Foundation, and one of the main services that we offer to member companies and member projects. We actually have a lot of experience on how to build this ecosystem around your source code, how to bring in more interested parties, how one important thing is making sure that there's everybody feel welcome and they don't feel like one company or one organization or one individual is dominating. So we have tools for governance, fair governance of project, making sure all voices are equal and people are not dominated. So it's really a set of, I would say, tools, know-how, people, LF staff who are really well versed in running communities that can help groups of people to kind of take their code to the next level and make it a real open source project that is a community-led one and with many different contributors and participants.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's that community and the governance, I think, is the key aspect. I mean, decisions are made through open meetings, and there's a high degree of transparency. Kind of the old way of doing open was pay me money to join the club, and then you can see the specs, and then we'll kind of develop in the behind the scenes, and so it's whereas this is done from a technical standpoint, of course, completely as a meritocracy and very, very transparently.
Well, and Jason, I'll jump in and say, that approach also helps someone like me who, might be fighting open source myths, right, internally. And I can say, yeah, I know what you're saying, but like, this isn't just some guy who like dropped code in it. Like, this is a real thing, right? There's right. Governance, right? There's oversight. It's supported, right? You can see it. So that approach is helpful, right? To sell internally for people who may not be sold on open source yet.
Yeah, and I've been on both sides of this, previously working for companies like yours and kind of selling the idea of open source, and it's not just throwing away our code or throwing away our resources, but we also in the Linux Foundation can help with selling it and promoting the idea of participation.
So PJ, you're like your own Ed McMahon, setting me up for setting me up.
That's what I'm here for.
All right, awesome. Well, I mean, so building on that, so you've got there's the kind of the fear factor of the free for all, or just it's not quality code, or those types of things. What other kind of myths have you seen? I mean, I'll probably go for the ask all of you guys, but what other myths have you seen that you've kind of had to overcome when it comes to code? In the open source community.
I think the security is the big one. I think, and that's been our challenge overall, right? With IoT, bringing IoT into the industrial space is this doesn't look and feel like the things that we've been doing. It doesn't really fit into our model. ISA 95, Purdue, and all these things. So when you talk about open source and we say, hey, we have this component, right? This intelligence or this module, right? That's doing something on the edge, and it's connected to our devices, people get real nervous about that. So you have to be able to show them why they shouldn't be nervous. And so, because otherwise they'll just turn it off, right? They'll just shut you down. So that's the big one. I think, support is the sort of the next one I would say is when we have a vendor provided solution, that comes with maintenance support, right? We pay for that every year. And whether or not that's good support, right? It's like, well, it makes you feel good, right? You have this support, you have someone you can call, and there's a perception that you don't get the same level of support with open source. So that's an ongoing fight as well.
Yeah, no, fair. And that's part of the point of kind of the happy medium of an open core model, where you've got the comfort of a key component, in like our case, or even with OpenZEDEDA, like in NetFoundry's example, like stuff that you'd have to drive a truck out and replace, if it's out in the field, if the any given part of the ecosystem was to disappear, kind of around it on the commercial side. That's the warm fuzzy compared to, it is nice to have the option to do it on your own, but people that will pick up the phone, good to have, as well, like options there. So,
I like the commercial model. I mean, I think we want it both ways, right? We want to be able to like deploy our own stuff and have control and not have to work through vendors, but we also want, at times, right, certain components, we don't want to have to worry about them. So what Philip was talking about earlier, it's aligning with where I want to take it, where, a big part of the company wants to take it, is that yes, we can look for partnerships, and it's not about the money, but we want the freedom, right? We want the freedom to do interesting things quickly, but we also, certain parts we don't want to have to worry about.
Right. Yeah, as we would say in the open source world, it's avoid undifferentiated heavy lifting.
Right.
The slogan I was seeing was freedom, not free.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's the approach. Right.
Yeah, I think that's key. So, yeah, I mean, just for those of you listening, I mean, imagine it's clear, but open core model, I mean, a great example, obviously, is like a Red Hat or whatnot, but, similar models where you build an open source base and then you wrap support and services around it, but you still have that flexibility as an end user. Philip, anything to kind of add on how that balance between the open source component and customers coming to you guys from a supported standpoint, and the kind of pros and cons of that, or some of the challenges you might see, of course, on top of the opportunities?
So at least from my personal experience, I don't see that many challenges, but then we do tend to lean towards customers who use open source already or are believers in it, rather than having
right
profiles where we're having to convince them of that aspect. I think there's, from the security perspective as well, 2021 was not a good year for non-open source vendors. There were many who, many years were going, oh, you can't trust open source. And then when you code in private and you get compromised, security is not done by obscurity. And one of the key aspects we have internally ourselves is in fact, I love it when that topic comes up, because one of the key things that we do on our commercial side is we dog food our own technology, so that all of the components that we use, our DevOps environments, our patching systems, all of these things are completely unaddressable on the internet because we're using our own technology. So you have this real differentiation of, well, yes, you can go host it yourself, or you can use our version, which has a much lower attack surface because we've built that same technology around how we deliver it to our end customers. So I think the key aspect from our perspective is we actually tend to go into conversations actually just pushing the open source, because if we can convince them the value of that component, normally what happens is they go off and they go, yeah, that sounds really cool, and then a few weeks later they go, you know what, I don't fancy hosting, managing, supporting, building my own automation orchestration engine. I'm just going to use yours. Maybe in the future, I'll go off and build my own and spend 4 years doing it, blah, blah, blah. But I can go to market and start innovating right now if I use your commercial version. So we lean into selling the open source rather than trying to defend it.
Right. Do you think it makes a difference for you guys? I mean, obviously, PJ, from an Oxy standpoint, your work is bridging the physical world to the digital world, and kind of industrial IoT, but also increasingly edge computing, and there are certainly different implications when you're rooted in kind of the industrial space, and considerations. Philip, do you think it's easier for you guys? You're coming at it from the networking standpoint, SD-WAN, but embed it inside of apps, and if you can kind of enable people with code that maybe already understand open source because they're coming from the IT world, the DevOps world, whatever. Do you think that's an advantage? Makes it a challenge, or is it just?
That's actually a very interesting question, because I literally this morning had a conversation with a guy who works in the OT world, and we're having a conversation of, can you apply zero trust principles into OT technology? And his initial position was, no, you can't. Purdue, you want to have data diodes or outbound microsegmentation, and you can't trust zero trust because that's part of IoT land, and that can't attach to OT. To which I said, you're viewing this through the wrong, or at least you're viewing it through the lens of how other people see zero trust, which is every single IT vendor saying, hey, I can deliver this thing to you. But if you're able to put your control plane, your policy, all of those components into your OT environment, now you can actually apply the principles of zero trust in OT, but not be breaking the Purdue model, which is something that OpenZT can do for users today, while simultaneously, if you're looking at it from the perspective, hey, I'm just an enterprise and I need to protect all my systems, if you flip it on its head and you say, I'm a vendor who is producing a robot or a SCADA system or HVAC, what if I can put private connectivity in that thing? And now my customer, he just maintains an outbound only connection, but yet he's able to, push configuration changes, attach to it and fix it if it goes wrong. That you get all those benefits without, again, breaking the Purdue model. That, I mean, there is a degree of truth to what you said, which is if you work in IT land, then you don't have the challenges that come along with OT environments. But that being said, I think it's a question of education and being able to explain to people about how our technology and approach is different to the 100 other vendors that say, hey, we're zero trust. We've slapped a label on it. And that means we're certified, because everyone's doing that. And it's unfortunately the misconceptions of marketing. I mean, at the same time, it definitely, particularly in an OT environment, there is more regulation. So, there are more hoops that you have to jump through. I don't think they're incompatible. I think it's just a learning curve.
Yeah, I think, education's a key part of it. And, there are, of course, misconceptions and whatnot. And it's part of it, I think, too. Maybe it's to take the first leap of faith, and then it's kind of less scary. You got to get over that initial hurdle, and then the network effect starts kicking in. Randy, from a Linux Foundation perspective, I mean, obviously there's companies that come in and join projects, help sponsor the projects, as part of the, to help fund the infrastructure. But then, of course, there's a technical meritocracy on the back end. What are some of the common, I guess maybe misconceptions or concerns that you're seeing for companies that are coming in from your angle, companies kind of starting to delve into the world of open source?
Yeah, so the companies that already come in are easy because they're in, but I think the challenge is getting the next company and the next industry. And I think there are different selling points. And I think touching upon the first topic that PJ mentioned, this vendor locking, I think everybody understands that. So if you go to an OT environment and they're not accustomed to open source, but if you tell them, hey, what if we can solve your vendor locking issue by you using more open source, I think it makes sense. So there are the selling points of open source, I think, would make sense no matter what industry you're part of. And I think a few of the major kind of hurdles for participation is the misconception that people in organization have is that, from day one, we have to bring an army of developers that need to churn out a lot of code. But that actually is not true. The communities and are very welcoming to end users type of participation, hearing from the end users, hearing from how they would think about using open source or what use cases they have in mind, because that's how we build our feature set, because there are no like classic product managers that set the roadmap. It's set by the needs of the end user. So people and companies can start their participation by just attending calls, commenting on Confluence and wiki pages, suggesting ideas for implementation. It doesn't have to be writing code from day one. It can also end up not writing any code, writing documentation or creating use cases and contributing them. So it can be a myriad of different types of participation, not just coding.
I'll just say I really appreciate that perspective, Randy, because I look at us and sort of we're not very mature in that way, in the sense that we reached out to open source to solve problems, right? And because we needed help, and it delivered that. But I would love to see us, sort of on board in that way. And I was curious, like, how do companies get, how do they mature in that way? And I hadn't even considered, hey, just like use cases, right? Like that's an easy way to get involved as a first step. And that's pretty easy. People love to tell you what their problems are, right? So
yeah, it's a huge one. I mean, and we've like CNCF, as an example, I think LF Networking, definitely LF Edge, we're spinning up kind of user forums and getting that feedback. And I think there's a perception too that as an end user that just wants to kick the tires, like, definitely it's okay to just date, up front. You don't have to get married and start hammering out code and whatnot. But I think there might be a perception that you have to give up certain, even just insights or IP that, just by nature of attaching to it in any way, or it just makes this big statement, to the world that you're changing your strategy or some big strategic intent change, and that can be hard to kind of overcome, or it can be concerning. But I think with just given the pervasiveness of open source today, I don't think it has to mean anything particular other than just like you're interested in kind of building off of learning from a community, and then whatever makes sense for you as a business, you can kind of grow from there. But it's not like you have to go 0 to 100 day one.
Yeah, and it could be grassroots, like even developers kind of kicking the tires and experimenting, and it doesn't have to start with a strategic decision, as you said.
Right. Yeah. A lot of it. I mean, the whole point is it's community, kind of grassroots. So PJ, so from your, so we're talking, of course, value of open source at the edge, and you mentioned just kind of how you guys got started. You had a kind of a vendor obsolescence issue, and you needed a solution, and kind of went to the community. But kind of what are some of the other areas you see opportunity? Just given some of the complexities of edge and IoT and fragmentation and all that. What are some other areas where you see open source being beneficial as you kind of looking into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I was pleased to make acquaintance with Philip, because he talks about software-defined networks, right? And that's something that's been on our mind lately. Like, how do we, how can we do that? We're certainly trying to solve specific problems, but I think I'm trying to take a little bit of a higher view. And what are the foundational things that we need to put in place, right? What's the infrastructure look like to really enable a lot of this stuff? So yeah, we're looking at software-defined networks. We're looking at edge, virtualization, right, is a big one. For our field assets, things are like you say, you don't want to have to drive anywhere if you can help it, right? That's probably one of the most dangerous things we do, honestly. So if you can provide a solution that prevents people from having to physically visit a location, that's a huge, people will listen to that. So yeah, we're looking at infrastructure management. We're looking at edge management, right? ZEDEDA is obviously, and Eve are obviously big parts of that for us. And so, yeah, that's the kind of thing. What is the right infrastructure that we can put in place to churn things out quicker, more secure, more reliable? Because the initially, it's a tough slog, right? Getting things up initially in a big organization where no one's ever done it before. There's people challenges, right? There's standard challenges. So I'm trying to look for like, what's the long term? What is the strategy? And open source, I think, plays a huge role in that.
Yeah, and maybe I think part of the a big benefit of how you're approaching it by like initially solve some problems, just get super tactical and leverage that for some initial wins, and then it that alone might kind of dispel some of the myths of open source that can seem scary to someone that's historically been a bit more leveraging proprietary investments and whatnot. And again, it's not all about just flip the bit completely, I guess, right. And then to completely open everything.
Right.
So
I think as well, I really like how you've kind of been sketching it out, PJ. And I think, again, I'm not on the organization side, but if I did go into the organization side, one of the first things I would do for my strategy would be doing what you have done, which I think, like if you look back over the last 30 years, I used to work for a systems integration, kind of during the noughties and the teens, everyone's going, let's just outsource everything at the cheapest possible cost, and then we'll get rid of people. And they lost a lot of that capability to actually build, and that meant that they were just either maintaining legacy or taking off the shelf solutions. But I think having just some core capability to do architectural, to understand the business problems, and to be able to look at what is, not just what's commercially available, what my vendors trying to sell me, but also what is available in the open source arena, enables you to bring a much better mindset to solving problems. I think there are organizations that are starting to bring some of that more, some of that stuff more in house, doing more things around DevOps and development. And I strongly believe having some of that internal capability so that you can really take advantage of what's out there delivers to the business the ability to solve customer problems quicker and innovate, which ultimately means revenue, and revenue can go up infinitely, whereas costs can only go down to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I'll point it back to Randy's about the community, right? So forget the code, right, for a second. I mean, the code's great, but you go onto these, you start looking for help, and you find out, oh wow, like these people have had the same problem, or these people have had a completely different approach to the same problem, or actually you don't have to do it that way at all. So that's a huge value in and of itself, is the people in the community. It makes you think of things that you just never would have thought of if you were talking to the same 5 vendors or whatever.
You remind me as well. We I don't remember what it was, but at some point in the previous past, we have this like online discourse for our OpenZT project, and the first time that someone posed a question and another user was like, "Oh, you fix it like this," there was this whole like, "Whoa, you're solving community problems. This is amazing!" And it's again, you don't get that in the commercial world. It's when's the person on the clock, and then they'll respond to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It works both ways. I think the communities also get some great and amazing ideas from the end users, because sometimes we don't expect how the software will be used. So that's the beauty of things. You can take as little or as much as you want from open source. By the way, it doesn't mean once you decide to go open source, you go open source all the way and take everything from open source. You can use just like a small piece, and you can maybe use it in a way that the creators never intended for it to be used, and that way you expand the usages of that piece of software, and that's part of the process.
Right. Yep. And so one of the other, I think, key considerations too. So one is just the pure mechanics of being able to benefit from code. So it's not about like eliminating all internal development at all. It's trying to help eliminate internal reinvention. Mm-hmm. And I always say you got to democratize the South, in terms of connectivity, to monetize the North. That's where the money is, and how you deliver things and all that. But so I think that's key. And then the other whole idea is how people are like, well, I need to give away IP. The best way to protect IP is to not share it. You can kind of dance around that, and it's people understanding too that the way, say, like Linux Foundation or a lot of code works. I think same with OpenZD is the licenses are permissive. You can go take that code and make sure, as long as you have a permissive license like Apache 2, you can take that code and wrap all you want around it and go to town and be as differentiated as you want, but you didn't have to reinvent the base. But at the same time, something to consider, and this goes back to the community, is that open source has emerged as the modern way to drive standards. Let's use the code to drive APIs that drive foster interoperability between different modules in a stack, and you can then be proprietary as you want around those modules, wherever you want to add value. But the APIs bind together the ecosystem, so that's a key. Yes, you can fork code and go off and do your own thing, but you might lock yourself out or kind of miss out on the network effect of the ecosystem. So I think that's another key thing, is it doesn't mean that everything's free. It just means that you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, I've worked for companies that, and I learned the hard way not to do what you just said, Jason. Like, we try to protect our IP just by keeping the code closed, and guess what? The community did the same thing better than us, standardized in a different way, and we got kind of locked out of what the rest of the industry is doing. So yeah, there's always some layer of value that you can add. But if it's the base, as you said, it's better to collaborate with the community and just help it create a standard, and then leave enough resources for you to create your differentiation.
And two things occurred to me while you were saying that, Jason. Is one, if talking about the education of open source, I think having a little bit of understanding on the different licenses, and knowing if you see Apache 2, like, oh yeah, really permissive, versus some of the ones which are not as permissive is very important to. In fact, I've spoke to people that when you tell them you're Apache 2, they're like, oh cool, we can work with you, that's easy. There's some where they're like, we're not going to touch that because that's more difficult. Yeah,
and that's just to clarify, if someone's not familiar, non-permissive means every contribution you make has to go back to the community, versus permissive. You can take the code, morph it, add to it, but then of course this is a trade-off, is if you fork it too much, then you sort of like, you're not part of the community anymore. But that's just a decision to make from a business standpoint. Anyway, sorry, just to make sure it's clear.
I was going to say the other one was that if you, in fact, I'll tell that, there's loads of companies that build these things. I think they call them like a tunnel or bridge or something like that. You build an outbound connection from the customer environment to their infrastructure, so they don't need inbound ports on the client side. That's great, but then the ISVA has to have their APIs being on the internet and could be attacked. But B, and more importantly, building that module is technical debt. That is you doing stuff which is not your core product and really adding the value on top of your AI platform, your edge platform, your analytics platform, whatever it's doing. So if you can just take an open source module which does it better and is being maintained by someone else, again, I see it less from the perspective of, oh, we're giving something away or we're having to adopt something we don't control. It's more, we can focus on what our true value is rather than building the underlying things which other people are doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that again. Sorry, Jason. I didn't mean
No. I was just, yeah.
Yeah, just another note. An attractiveness, right, in this model of sort of having a core open source component is, I think it keeps people honest in the sense that there may not necessarily be a commercial competitor, but the fact that there could be is useful, right? It sort of says we aren't locked into you, and if we had to, the market would supply a competitor. And I think that helps to keep people honest. So it makes someone like me feel better about committing, right, to a solution, to a vendor that has a core open source component.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where the APIs come in. I think both for an open ZD standpoint or from EvoS is anyone could use those APIs and build their own commercial model around it. Is that the right thing to do for your business, or should you focus on applications or solutions, services, whatever, your domain knowledge? But it is a nice warm fuzzy that it is a potential. And when I say drive trucks out, like especially when it comes to foundational things like a bare metal operating system, if that's proprietary and you want to switch, you are driving a truck out to stick USB sticks in there and replace it. So that's a big difference compared to some other elements of the stack. But yeah, so I know we're coming up on time. PJ, just any other kind of final thoughts, from your perspective?
Yeah, just for I'm not sure who's all in the audience, but one of the things that I had to learn and struggle through was make sure you talk to your supply chain folks, right? Because that's a whole nother side of it. Forget the technology. Like, what's this open source thing? What is the licensing? What do we get? What do we don't? Like they are very concerned if they've never dealt with that before. That takes a while to kind of walk them through what it is, what are all those, the T's and C's or whatever they call them, right? So, so make sure you don't avoid that, right? Because they'll just legal just like stop you if they don't understand it.
Yeah, no, very fair. Cool, Philip. Any kind of last thoughts as we wrap up?
Actually, I'll just what Kathy just put in the window is it's completely correct and very well timed, Kathy. Open core is the future, but don't try and reinvent things. Find something that is open source and you can take yourself, or get the the supported version of it so you can build more value on top of what you're doing. And then finally, obviously, being a salesperson, I have to say, check out OpenZT, check out NetFoundry. Maybe we've got a problem you can solve.
Yeah, cool. Randy, any closing thoughts? Your perspective?
Yeah, if there's maybe one takeaway I want the audience to take from today is that open source, all open source communities are really open, and you can start participating any way that makes sense for you. It's pretty perfect to start by just lurking and listening and learning, and then deciding what you want to do. And if you decide, hey, it's not for me, that's cool as well. But please feel free. People are welcome to join communities in any way they see fit.
Yeah.
And just as you were saying it, sorry, Randy, Jason, literally, all of these things have Slack channels, so you can go in and you can just put your hey, I've got this problem. Can this project solve it? And people just be like, oh, what about this? What about this? It's so open, and yeah, very easy to exploit that.